The wind has not changed in 40,000 years. It still moves across open ground the same way it did when the first of us stood upright and understood, perhaps for the first time, that the night was coming and there was nowhere to hide. Imagine standing where they stood, the sun falling behind a ridge of stone, the temperature dropping so quickly you can feel it in your teeth. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of something moving through dry grass. You are alone, or nearly alone, and the darkness is arriving with the patience of something that knows it will always win. This is the moment that made us what we are, not the discovery of fire, not the shaping of tools, but the understanding that without walls, without enclosure, without something between your body and the world, you would not survive until morning. The first architecture was not a luxury, it was a negotiation with death. We begin in a place that no longer exists in the way it once did. A shallow overhang of limestone, perhaps 30 meters long, tucked into the side of a hill in what is now southern France. The rock above curves downward like the brow of some ancient sleeping creature, and beneath it, the ground is dry. The wind cannot reach here, the rain slides off and away. And in the fading light of a day that ended over 30,000 years ago, a small group of humans pressed their backs against the stone and watched the world outside with eyes that never stopped moving. This was not a home, it was a threshold, a boundary between survival and extinction. And everything about the way they arranged themselves beneath that overhang, the way they positioned their bodies, the way they built small barriers of stone and branch at the edges of the space, was intentional. It was designed, not with blueprints, not with language as we know it, but with something deeper. An instinct refined over hundreds of thousands of years of being hunted, of being cold, of watching others die because they had nowhere to go when the darkness came. The earliest shelters were not built, they were found. Caves carved by water over millions of years. Rock overhangs created by the slow collapse of cliff faces. Hollows beneath fallen trees. Depressions in the earth where the wind could not follow. These were the first defensive positions, and the humans who found them understood something that would shape every structure built for the next 40 millennia. The geometry of a space determines who survives. A cave with a single narrow entrance is not just a place to sleep, it is a choke point, a position of advantage. One adult with a sharpened stick can hold that entrance against almost anything. The darkness inside, which might seem like a vulnerability, is in fact a weapon. Your eyes adjust. You can see the light at the entrance, but anything approaching from outside sees nothing. It sees a hole in the rock, and it does not know what waits within. This is the first principle of survival architecture. Control the threshold. Make the entrance small enough that only one threat can approach at a time. Make the interior dark enough that you become invisible. Make the walls solid enough that nothing can come at you from the sides. This is not comfort. This is combat geometry. The archaeological record is unambiguous on this point. Across every continent where early humans lived, we find the same patterns repeated again and again. Shelters with single entrances, shelters with walls that curve inward, limiting visibility from outside. Shelters positioned at elevated points where approach can be observed from a distance. Shelters with narrow passages leading to larger interior chambers, creating layers of defense. At the cave site of Blombos in South Africa, dating back nearly 100,000 years, we find evidence of humans selecting living spaces not for their size or comfort, but for their defensibility. At the rock shelters of Abri-Pataud in France, we find systematic arrangement of stones to narrow entrances and control access. At the early pit houses of the Anatolian Plateau, we find structures dug into the earth with roof entries only, meaning the only way in or out was through a hole in the ceiling, accessible by ladder. Remove the ladder, and you have created an impenetrable position, a fortress made of absence. These were not accidents. These were decisions made by minds that understood vulnerability with a precision we can barely imagine. Every wall was a calculation. Every entrance was a prediction. Every shadow was a strategy. The cold was perhaps the most patient killer. It did not chase, it did not roar, it simply waited, and it waited everywhere. On open ground, a human body loses heat with terrifying efficiency. Wind strips warmth from skin. Wet clothing becomes a death sentence. Even the ground itself, frozen or merely cool, will draw heat from a sleeping body hour after hour until the heart simply stops. The earliest shelters were thermal machines, though that term would not have meant anything to the people who built them. They understood, through observation and through loss, that certain shapes held heat better than others. A circular structure with a domed roof traps warm air as it rises. A rectangular structure with flat walls allows heat to disperse into corners where no one sits. A pit dug into the earth uses the constant temperature of the ground itself as insulation. A narrow entrance prevents the cold wind from pushing inside. These principles were not discovered once. They were discovered thousands of times, independently, across generations and continents, because the physics of survival do not change. At the Paleolithic site of Mezyrich in Ukraine, dating to approximately 15,000 years ago, we find structures built from the bones of mammoths, arranged in circular patterns and covered with hides. These were not crude improvisations. The bones were selected for size and shape. They were positioned to interlock. The hides were layered and sealed with fat. Inside these structures, even in temperatures that could kill an exposed human in hours, people lived and reproduced and endured. The architecture was their survival system, and it worked because it was designed to work. But shelter was never only about temperature, and it was never only about predators. It was about something more subtle and more powerful. It was about the human mind itself. We are creatures who cannot function in constant fear. The sustained release of stress hormones degrades cognition, disrupts sleep, impairs digestion, and eventually destroys the body from within. To survive, we needed more than walls. We needed the feeling of safety, and the earliest shelters provided that feeling through design. Consider what it means to be inside a space where you cannot be seen. Consider the psychological weight that lifts when you know nothing can approach without your awareness. Consider the way the mind relaxes, even slightly, when the boundaries of the world shrink to something manageable. 4 walls, a roof, a single door. This is a territory you can understand. This is a domain you can control. The shelter does not only protect the body, it protects the psyche. It creates a boundary between the self and the chaos of existence. And this boundary, this architecture of psychological containment, is one of the oldest technologies our species ever developed. The evidence for this is written in the structures themselves. At Çatalhöyük, the Neolithic settlement in central Turkey dating back over 9,000 years, we find a pattern that appears irrational at first glance. The houses have no doors. Entry and exit happened through holes in the roofs, accessed by ladders. Inside, the walls were smooth, white, painted with images of hunts and of death. The dead were buried beneath the floors, directly under the platforms where the living slept. This makes no practical sense if we think of shelter only as protection from weather and animals. But it makes perfect sense if we understand that shelter was also a machine for processing fear, memory, and meaning. The dead beneath the floor are not forgotten. They are incorporated. They become part of the structure itself. The walls covered with images of danger and death are not decorations. They are rituals made permanent. Every night, the inhabitants of these houses slept above their ancestors, surrounded by paintings of the threats that shaped their existence, enclosed in a space that no one could enter without descending from above. This was not a house. It was a psychological fortress, a container for identity, a structure that told you who you were, who your people had been, and what you needed to fear and remember to survive. The architecture was doing cognitive work. It was shaping minds even as it protected bodies. This principle, that shelter encodes survival knowledge into physical form, extends across every human culture that has left traces in the archaeological record. The igloo of the Arctic is not just a dome of snow. It is a carefully calculated thermal system with an entrance tunnel that traps cold air below the living space, a ventilation hole that prevents carbon dioxide accumulation, and a raised sleeping platform positioned in the warmest air pocket of the interior. The Longhouse of the Iroquois is not just a large communal structure. It is a social machine that positions families according to kinship, regulates access to shared resources through spatial arrangement, and encodes hierarchy into the very placement of hearths along the central corridor. The cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans at Mesa Verde are not just difficult to reach. They are positioned to be defensible, to capture winter sun while blocking summer heat, to store grain in protected alcoves, and to observe the approach of strangers from positions of visual dominance. Every detail is intentional. Every design choice carries the weight of accumulated survival knowledge, transmitted not through words, but through the structures themselves. The children who grew up in these places did not need to be told why the entrance was where it was, or why the walls were shaped as they were. They absorbed the knowledge simply by living within it. The architecture taught them. The evolution of shelter across human history is not a story of increasing comfort. It is a story of increasing control. Each advancement in construction technology, from stone to mud brick to timber framing to metal and concrete, has allowed humans to exercise greater dominion over the variables that once threatened survival. We learned to build in flood zones by raising structures on platforms. We learned to build in earthquake regions by developing flexible joinery systems that absorb seismic energy. We learned to build in deserts by using thick walls that delay the transfer of heat, keeping interiors cool during the day and warm during the night. We learned to build in forests by clearing defensible perimeters while maintaining access to timber and game. Every environment presented a unique set of threats, and every successful shelter tradition represents a solution refined over generations of trial and failure. The failures are invisible to us now. The people who built shelters that did not work did not leave descendants. They died, and their designs died with them. What survives in the archaeological record is the residue of success. These are the structures that kept people alive long enough to reproduce, to teach their children, to transmit the knowledge forward. We are the inheritors of a selection process as ruthless as any in nature, and the shelters we live in today carry the genetic memory, if we can call it that, of every structure that came before. But there is something troubling in this lineage. Somewhere in the long development from cave to castle to apartment building, something shifted. The connection between design and survival, once absolute and undeniable, became obscured. Modern architecture does not speak of survival. It speaks of aesthetics, of efficiency, of market value. Our buildings are climate controlled not by the intelligence of their design, but by machines that consume energy extracted from the earth. Our walls are not thick because we need thermal mass. They are thin because thin walls are cheaper to build. Our entrances are not narrow because we need to control access. They are wide because wide entrances feel welcoming to customers. We have outsourced the survival function of architecture to technology, and in doing so, we have forgotten why the old shapes existed at all. The narrow entrance, the elevated position, the single point of access, the darkness within. These were not arbitrary choices. They were responses to a world that wanted us dead. And though we have convinced ourselves that the threats have changed, that we no longer need to fear the cold or the predator or the hostile stranger in the dark, the architecture of our minds has not evolved as quickly as our buildings. We still feel safer in enclosed spaces. We still sleep better with our backs to a wall. We still experience anxiety in glass structures where we can be seen from all directions. The instincts remain. It is only the architecture that is forgotten. And perhaps this is the question we must carry forward. What happens to a species that no longer builds for survival? What happens when the accumulated wisdom of 40,000 years of shelter design is abandoned in favor of trends, of cost savings, of aesthetic novelty? The old shelters were not beautiful in the way we understand beauty. They were severe. They were minimal. They were shaped entirely by the requirements of staying alive. But in that severity, there was a kind of honesty. The structure told you exactly what it was for. It told you where to sleep, where to watch, where to retreat if something went wrong. It told you that the world outside was dangerous and that within these walls, for a few hours at least, you might be safe. Our modern structures tell us different stories. They tell us to consume, to display, to perform comfort for others to see. They tell us that danger is something that happens elsewhere, to other people, in other kinds of buildings. They tell us that we have transcended the old calculus of survival, that technology has freed us from the tyranny of cold and heat and threat, but the wind still blows, the night still comes, and somewhere beneath the glass and steel and drywall of our modern shelters, there is a part of us that still listens for movement in the dark, still scans for the single point of entry, still calculates whether the walls are thick enough and the entrance narrow enough to keep us alive until morning. We are still the same animal that pressed its back against the stone of that limestone overhang 30,000 years ago and watched the shadows with unblinking eyes. The only difference is that now we have forgotten why we are afraid, and perhaps that forgetting is the greatest danger of all.